John Marini is a professor of political science at the University of Nevada, Reno, and a distinguished resident fellow at the Kirby Center. A senior fellow at the Claremont Institute and a member of the Nevada Advisory Committee of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, he served from 1987 to 88 as a special assistant to Clarence Thomas, who was then chairman of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Dr. Marini received his BA from San Jose State University and his PhD in government from the Claremont Graduate School. He is the author of The Politics of Budget Control, Congress, the Presidency, and the Growth of the Administrative State, and co-editor of the Imperial Congress, Crisis in the Separation of Powers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Marini.
Thank you. It's nice to be back at the Kirby Center. I was here before, and now I'm in residence here, so that's even better. Last week, when I was told about this lecture, I was informed that the title of the lecture was to be The Budget Battles and the Growth of the Administrative State. The publicity for the lecture had gone out before I learned of the topic. Since this is only my second week at the Kirby Center, I thought I should do what I'm told. But in fact, it is a good title. It brings to mind an important question, the answer to which can help elucidate the relationship between the budget process and the administrative state. The question is this: why did the federal budget attain unparalleled significance at the heart of American politics? This is so not just in the last few years, but with few exceptions. The budget process has established itself as the battleground between the executive and legislative branches in nearly every administration since LBJ's Great Society. The Great Society had attempted to expand the public sector in an unprecedented manner, co-opting political and administrative power that had long been the domain of local and state governments. But the attempt to consolidate a centralized administrative apparatus within the framework of American government was not without its problems. Initially, it created resistance in the states, the parties, and the electorate. And it changed the way the national institutions, the states, and the political parties related to each other. Although presidents in the 20th century had long pushed for a larger public sector, Congress, with its state and local ties, had resisted. By the early 70s, after reorganizing itself, Congress became a defender of administrative centralization, and Republican presidents appeared to be opponents of its expansion. In terms of Washington politics, it had the effect of undermining the operation of the constitutional separation of powers. It has made it more difficult for the institutions to function amicably in pursuit of a national interest. It's for this reason that the relations between the political branches of government, Congress and the president, as well as the bureaucracy, have become increasingly hostile since the consolidation of a centralized administrative system. It's not far-fetched to say that the acceptance of a modern budget system as a principal mechanism of organizing politics made it possible to put in place and make operative a distinctively American administrative state. In America, the administrative state traces its origins to the progressive movement. Progressivism was a political movement inspired by the political theory of Hegel, known as the philosophy of history. Put simply, that view presupposed the end of history, the end of philosophy and religion, and the end of politics. In short, it meant there was no longer any need for conflict over fundamental principles of the kind that led to political and religious strife. The modern state itself would be the guarantor of the rights of man and the embodiment of the ethical ideal. Or as Hegel put it, the state itself, which is a rational and ethical organism, should be worshipped as a secular deity. Those are his words. With the end of politics, the human problem would come to be seen as a rational or technical problem. Politics would give way to administration, and hence would become the domain of expert knowledge, or organized intelligence, as Hegel called it. The American founders in the Constitution they framed and was established upon a radically different foundation, one based on nature and natural right, not history. As James Madison noted, factionalism is sewn into the nature of man. Therefore, politics cannot be transcended, nor can philosophy or religion. So justice is the end of government, as Madison said, and it remains the highest human aspiration concerning politics. But tyranny, the opposite of political justice, is also a danger coeval with political life. It is human nature, therefore, which makes it necessary to establish limitations on the power of government. Progressive leaders were hostile to the Constitution, not merely because it imposed limits upon the power of the national government, but because it provided almost no role for the central government in the area of administration. The separation of powers inhibited the creation of a unified will in government and made it impossible to establish a technical or neutral apparatus to carry out that will. The executive budget system was among the most important political reforms demanded by the early progressives. A presidential budget, along with party reform, would allow activist presidents the ability to pursue the unified will of a national majority, and it would make it possible to establish a non-partisan bureaucracy to carry out that will. It was not surprising, therefore, that the United States was the last modern industrial nation to adopt an executive budget. Congress was reluctant to give presidents the authority to formulate budgets because it was thought such prerogative would undermine the separation of powers and endanger individual freedom. Throughout much of American history, conflict over control of public finances had been contained because there was a consensus concerning the size and purposes of the federal government. Administrative functions at the national level were few, in keeping with a federal system of decentralized administration, as well as an autonomous civil society and a constitutional system that underscored the limited character of government. By the 1970s, when Congress reorganized itself so as to be a major player in the administrative process, passed legislation you're familiar with, budget control, campaign finance, etc. The growth of the administrative state began the process of undermining the political and public consensus in support of limited government. Subsequently, it also eroded support for limiting expenditures and balancing budgets. Moreover, the president and Congress, national majorities, and organized private interests became rival forces and constituencies committed to purposes that were often impossible to reconcile in a manner compatible with a long-term public interest. In the 70s and 80s, Republican presidents responded to and began to mobilize majorities in opposition to the consolidation or expansion of the administrative state. Congress, long controlled by the Democratic Party, now allied with the newly centralized organized private interests, developed a stake in the maintenance and expansion of the administrative state. The federal budget, a potential instrument for fueling the growth of the administrative state, subsequently came to be the point of control from which both political branches and both parties attempted to maintain, expand, or limit, and perhaps, if you're a utopian, scale down the size of the public sector. President Reagan showed that the budget process could be used to limit spending as well as to reduce the burden of administrative regulations. Nonetheless, the failure of the national institutions of government and the national political parties to achieve a new consensus or political realignment concerning the purpose and level of public spending by the federal government made budget control nearly impossible. For much of the last 50 years, in an era in which divided government has become the rule rather than the exception. The national budget process, with its taxing, spending, and regulatory authority, has become the focal point of the American administrative state. It is the place where political institutions and public bureaucracies have attempted to accommodate the various interests and constituencies seeking a share of the national wealth. The expansion of the public sector, which accompanied the increased size of public budgets, began a process that undermined the distinction between the public and private sphere, between government and civil society. Subsequently, it became increasingly difficult for the political institutions to recognize the difference between governing, which required making political choices based on available resources, and budgeting, which was simply the provision, adequate provision for the funding of government programs. In the last decade or so, Congress could not even pass the 13 or so appropriations bills that constitute a budget. As a result of the ongoing use of continuing resolutions, this actually allows the government bureaucracy to determine its own needs and the necessary resources, free from ongoing and detailed political control by the legislature. In such circumstances, those supportive of the status quo, meaning the administrative state, whether in the bureaucracy, the legislative branch, or the executive branch, have become a faction on behalf of government itself. Consequently, there has been no effective national political institution that operates on behalf of a public interest which is responsive to the unorganized electorate that has no access to the administrative state. And you can see polls since this process began that the public's confidence in the national government has declined precipitously over the last over 40 or 50 years. In an earlier time, there was widespread agreement that the political institutions could tightly control expenditures of government. Budgets provided the means of limiting claims based upon available resources in a manner compatible with the long-term public good. In this period before the consolidation of the administrative state, it was possible to achieve a consensus concerning budgets while limiting the costs of the federal government's administrative function. This was possible because they were few. In other words, state and local governments undertook most administrative tasks. There was a bipartisan consensus concerning the autonomy of the economic marketplace and the distinction between the public and private sphere. In terms of public finance, limited government meant limited and balanced budgets in normal times. Public spending and public debt were viewed in moral terms as evils to be avoided so as to limit the tax burden upon the working man. Federal budget process has become the principal instrument of politics in the American administrative state. The growing inability to control the budget is a symptom of a deeper crisis which arises from the failure of the administrative state to function effectively because it has not gained legitimacy within a constitutional regime of separated powers. In a constitutional system, the powers of government are thought to be limited. The administrative state, only the lack of resources has established any reasonable limits on public spending. But in the last few years, those who defend or seek to expand the administrative state have learned that printing or borrowing money in the absence of political constraints can fuel almost limitless demands for public resources on behalf of the constituencies of the administrative state as determined by bureaucratic or judicial fiat. It seems the only point of opposition to unlimited administrative growth left to political decision makers in Congress is the apparent choice of refusing to raise the debt ceiling. But it is difficult to stop a process after it has been completed. With some justification, I say some, not much, President Obama denies that this is a legitimate political tactic, considering that all of the institutions have participated in the process at every junction. Not equally, we could say, however. It is clear that since the consolidation of the administrative state between 1965 and 75, both of the political branches of government have contributed to its expansion at one time or another. But that has provided the opportunity in the electorate for those in support as well as those in opposition to turn to either of the political branches to ratify their choices. In short, there has been no consensus or political realignment that has succeeded in legitimizing the administrative state, so it rests uneasily within a constitutional structure of limited government whose political powers were meant to be used only on behalf of constitutional purposes. The important question in terms of the growth of the administrative state is this: how did the political institutions come to embrace the administrative state, and why has it been so hard to reverse its direction? In my view, the decisive event was the political transformation of Congress that occurred in the decade between 65 and 75. It is difficult for us to remember how Congress worked and what the expectations were concerning its role in the constitutional order before 1965. In a time when the presidency seemed to dominate the political landscape, conservatives were the defenders of Congress. In 1959, James Burnham, in his book Congress in the American Tradition, suggested that, and I quote, "the political death of Congress would mean plebiscitary despotism for the United States in place of constitutional government, and thus the end of political liberty." Burnham believed that, and I quote, "to keep their political liberty, Americans must keep and cherish their Congress." Burnham traced the decline of the legislative body to the rise of the executive and the growth of the bureaucratic state. He insisted that, quote again, "Congress has let major policy decisions go by default to the unchecked will of the executive and bureaucracy." This is 59, remember. In order to retain its status as first among equals, Burnham insisted that, and I quote, "Congress must find a way to concentrate on essentials. If it is to continue to be a partner and peer within the central government, then its principal energies must go to deciding major issues of policy, not to the critique of details," end quote. He assumed, and this is the last quote from him, "the assemblies by their very nature cannot be bureaucratized in the modern mode," end quote. Burnham foresaw the growth of the bureaucratic state, but he did not foresee a role for the legislative branch within that state. Was Burnham right in his assumption that legislative assemblies could not be bureaucratized and instead would become obsolete? That was his thesis. More than 50 years after Burnham, John Samples, a scholar at Cato, assessed the role of Congress in starkly different terms. He insisted that Congress has reasserted its powers in many areas and has proved to be more than a match in terms of exercising that power in defense against encroachments by the other branches of government. He does not deny that, and I quote from him, "the New Deal and its echoes did set Congress on a declining path toward obsolescence, and in 1959, the administrative welfare state seemed triumphant." Had the 15 years after World War II continued for the next 50, James Burnham's bold prediction might well have been confirmed, including the demise of Congress. But the administrative welfare state lost and never quite regained public confidence. And if those athwart history did not stop its progress, they did not also fall under its wheels. That's the quote from Samples. The question remains, when historians look back at the beginning of the post-New Deal, will they note with surprise the revival of the United States Congress? That's what Sample was asking. And he thinks they would. But and I don't deny that it's hard really to deny that Congress, when unified, has ample power in terms of defending itself against the other branches. However, is Samples right in his assumption that not Congress, but the administrative welfare state lost the confidence of the American people? Is that right? Or is it the case that Congress itself had become an integral part of the administrative welfare state? I suggest that Burnham was only partly right in his insistence that Congress holds the key to the preservation of political liberty in America. He assumed that his term, legislative supremacy, was the fundamental condition of the maintenance of Republican government. However, the American founders did not believe that Congress as an institution would or could be the primary defender of liberty, nor did they depend upon the presidency nor the Supreme Court exclusively to fulfill that role. The American founders established the Constitution and the separation of powers as the surest defender of freedom. This was to be done by subordinating the power of all political branches to their constitutional purpose. It was the result of an abandon of their constitutional role that made it possible for both political branches of government, and in varying degrees, both of the political parties, to participate in the establishment and consolidation of the administrative state. Those actions provoked their own reaction in the electorate in opposition to the growth and the expansion of the administrative state. The electorate turned to one or the other of the political branches at various times to expand or limit the administrative state. In hindsight, it appears that Burnham was wrong in assuming that assemblies cannot be bureaucratized in the modern mode. It is only constitutional assemblies that cannot be legitimately bureaucratized, precisely because deliberation and general lawmaking remain their fundamental political and constitutional purpose. In denying Burnham's claim that Congress would cease to be a major player in modern government, Samples has shown that a revival of Congress indicated that it had been possible for Congress to give up its lawmaking power without relinquishing its authority over those administrative bodies to which it had delegated that power. In other words, it had become possible for Congress to establish itself as a major player in the politics of the administrative state. Burnham's book was written before Congress reorganized itself to accommodate its transformation from primarily a legislative body to an administrative oversight body. Throughout much of the 20th century, as I've said, presidents of both political parties had fought to aggrandize the administrative component of government, pushing Congress to expand the executive branch. Congress, representative of local interests, still tied to state power, was reluctant to do so. It remained a defender of decentralized administration because it insisted upon maintaining its deliberative and lawmaking function. This changed in 1965. In 1965, Samuel Huntington, professor at Harvard, noted that Congress could not continue to function as a national institution because politically it represented parochial and state interests. As a result, he insisted that the presidency had come to be the dominant force in national politics, and therefore, and I'm quoting, today's aggressive spirit is clearly the executive branch. This is Huntington in 1965. The loss of power by Congress, Huntington suggested, and I'm quoting again, can be measured by the extent to which congressional assertion coincides with congressional obstruction. This paradox has been at the root of the problem of Congress since the early days of the New Deal. Vis-a-vis the executive, Congress is an autonomous legislative body. But apparently, Congress can defend its autonomy only by refusing to legislate, and it can legislate only by surrendering its autonomy. Congress can assert its powers, or it can pass laws, but it cannot do both. That's Huntington, 1965. Apparently, Huntington was convinced that that administrative centralization was necessary and perhaps inevitable, and Congress would have to adapt to it. There was another option for the legislative branch. Congress could adapt itself to the requirement of a centralized administrative state, but it could only do so if it gave up the power to refuse to legislate on behalf of the administrative state. It was necessary to relinquish its primary constitutional function of deliberation and lawmaking in the national interest and use its legislative power in the service of the administrative state. It did so by wholesale delegation of power to newly created administrative and regulatory bodies whose ostensible authority was dependent upon technical or rational knowledge. Congress could retain its autonomy and political authority by establishing itself as the overseer of the executive branch. In the process, individual committees and members were empowered to oversee the various departments and agencies of the executive branch. They would soon become major players in the policy-making process. Subsequently, Congress would become an administrative oversight body. Ultimately, it would become, in one political scientist, Morris Fiorina's phrase, the keystone of the Washington establishment. The Constitution, its separation of power, and the politics of federalism had inhibited Washington from achieving such centralization. The progressive intellectuals had advanced the theoretical doctrine of the administrative state, and the New Deal had attempted to expand and legitimize the administrative state. But the administrative state was not institutionalized in any permanent way within the framework of American politics until Congress reorganized itself as the keystone of the bureaucratic state. When that occurred, from 65 to 75, the constitutional separation of powers and the federal system was fundamentally altered. At the time, many in Congress objected to the transformation. One Congressman, Gillis Long, expressed the early complaint. He noted, "We, Congress, were turning ours from an institution that was supposed to be a broad policy-making institution with respect to the problems of the country and its relationship to the world into merely a city council that overlooks the running of the store every day," end quote. Now, those objections were ineffectual and short-lived. After a few years of experience, members of Congress came to prefer administrative regulation to deliberation and legislation. Representative Jamie Witt summed up the view of many in Congress subsequently when he said, "The smartest thing we ever did was to throw the weight of the federal government behind local problems." After that transformation, characteristic of the federal activity of the federal government and the legislature had become the regulation or the administration of the details of social, political, and economic life in the nation. Such a development could only strengthen the organized interest and their ties to the legislature or the bureaucracies, often at the expense of political control of administration. Even sympathetic observers of Congress, the power of Congress, did not fail to notice the change at that time. James Sundquist, who was at Brookings, said, "As members become managers of professional staffs, the chambers disintegrate as deliberative bodies in the traditional sense of legislators engaged in direct interchange of views, leading to a group decision. With each passing year, the House and Senate appears less as collective institutions and more as collections of institutions, individual member staff groups organized as offices and subcommittees." After the centralization of administration, the operations and interests of the executive and legislative branch were fundamentally transformed. The role of the political parties was diminished because bureaucratic patronage would become more important than party patronage. In addition, the function of the judiciary was transformed as well. In the administrative state, the bureaucracy has no constitutional authority, but it is given enormous power by the political branches. Consequently, the courts have been required to enter the policy-making arena as the final arbiters in the adjudication of cases arising in the administrative process. As a result, they have become fundamental players in the political and policy-making process. In legitimizing policies of the agencies, the unelected courts have protected the political branches from accountability for policies that are derived almost exclusively from the administrative process. Even when they are deeply unpopular, the electorate has no access to the centers of power in the administrative state. Congress controls the administrative details of politics through the bureaucracy, and the judiciary reigns supreme in the realm of political principle. The Supreme Court determines what passes for the moral will of society by construing what passes for the contemporary meaning of the Constitution. In other words, the political branches are allowed to stray from their constitutional purpose by the Supreme Court, which makes the Supreme Court the fundamental arbiter of what the Constitution means. Insofar as Congress is still tempted to make general laws on behalf of a perceived public good, it does so primarily on behalf of the expansion of the administrative state. For example, one in the news right now, Congress passed what appeared to be a general law concerning health care reform, the Obama administration's Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. But it is clear this is not a law in the constitutional sense. It makes sense only within the context of an administrative state. The health reform bill was more than 2,500 pages long, but it was not a general law. Rather, it established the legal requirements necessary to provide the administrative apparatus with the legal right and power to formulate the rules which would govern health care nationwide. The extension of governmental power is compatible with the administrative state, but it cannot be understood to be within the letter or spirit of constitutional government. John Locke, perhaps the most important theorist of the Constitution, described law as a community's settled standing rules indifferent and the same to all parties, emphasizing that to be legitimate a statute must be, and I'm quoting, received and allowed by common consent to be the standard of right and wrong and the common measure to decide all controversy between citizens. But it is difficult to find any settled standing rules or a meaning that is indifferent and the same to all parties in the healthcare law. In fact, such laws are not meant to protect everyone's rights or liberty equally. As Charles Kessler noted in the Claremont Review of Books at the time, that's the point of the legislation. I quote from him, "They start not from equal rights, but from equal and often unequal privileges. The favors or benefits that government may bestow or withhold from its clients. The whole point is to empower government officials, usually unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats, to bless or curse your petition as they see fit, guided, of course, by their expertness in a law so vast, so intricate, and so capricious that it could justify 100 different outcomes in the same case. As a result, a government of equal laws turns into a regime of arbitrary privileges. A privilege is literally a private law. When law ceases to be a common standard of right and wrong and a common measure to decide all controversies, then the rule of law ceases to be republican and becomes despotic. Freedom itself ceases to be a right and becomes a gift, or the fruit of a corrupt bargain, as Kessler calls it, because in such degraded regimes, those who are close to and connected with the ruling class have special privileges. Now, one can see the way Obama gave special privileges to Congress and their staff. In other words, this kind of extension of governmental power is wholly incompatible with constitutionalism, but it's fundamentally the way the administrative state operates. In conclusion, let me say that Congress is a major player in the administrative state, but it would be difficult to say that it performs its constitutional purpose. Congress as an institution is no longer the defender of limited government, nor is it the center of a dynamic federal system in which the states participated in maintaining the political conditions of decentralized administration which were conducive to human freedom. Moreover, the states have accommodated themselves to centralized government and administration. They are now mere petitioners of the federal government. The administrative state, often with the blessing of Congress, grew dramatically in the last third of the 20th century. And it continues to defend its turf and expand when possible. Political opposition arises in one or the other branch, depending upon circumstance. Despite its expansion, however, under both parties, it has not attained legitimacy within the constitutional order. The Constitution itself remains the source of authority and legitimacy for those in and out of government who are opposed to the administrative state. Until the administrative state becomes legitimized or constitutionalism delegitimized, an ongoing debate within the parties and the electorate concerning the desirability of expansion, limitation, or diminution of the size and scope of the federal government is almost inevitable. Thank you.
Brilliant analysis. I guess the root of a lot of problems. So what, practically speaking, do you see short term, what should we work on to solve this problem?
Yeah, that is the hard question. I think, look, you have opportunities in both political branches, I think. People who want to defend and try to advance the constitutional purposes of government. So political parties, as I say, it's hard to, you don't have grassroots political parties, really. The administrative state has made that much more difficult to utilize that as a means to change things. I mean, you can see the way the Tea Party originated, and yet it appeared to have no leadership. It appeared to be amorphous. But that's the way there's a certain kind of protest that arises that way because there is not really organized ways. And we can see, even then, the bureaucracy harassed those folks who were trying to utilize the political system to bring about a way of thinking about this. The reason why I make the arguments I make is I think first we have to understand what this problem is, what the depth of the problem is. And many people in Washington, I think, simply do not, because you're too close to it.
Where's the microphone, John?
Yeah, oh, sorry. Anyway, it is very difficult to first grasp in a conceptual way what the problem is so that we know where we can go. Also, then you need to be able to convince other people. It would be nice to have leaders periodically, like Reagan, or somebody who could mobilize a sentiment on behalf of some of this. Try to mobilize constituency. Because all of the thing about Washington is it works quite well for organized interest. It's just the unorganized public that has great problem with the way Washington works. And yet how do you've got all of the wealth, much of the wealth, certainly, that's generated in the modern state that goes toward maintaining the status quo because there's so many benefits that can be achieved for business, for social interest, even religious interests. It's hard to say that there are even autonomous religions that actually are separate from government. Government wants to fund everything. And in doing so, of course, it makes it much more difficult then to mobilize opinion in a way that's politically effective on behalf of opposition to that. There's a lot to be gained by those who have access to government. And in the public at large, most people go about just living their lives. They become dissatisfied, but it's very difficult. I would say to start, I think it's important to get people in the offices, whether in the legislative branch or the executive branch, who understand what the problem is, and who, in whatever small way, because look, it took a long time to build the administrative state. It took most of the 20th century. It's not going to be destroyed in a matter of 1 or 2 or 3 election cycles. It's because the administrative state itself destroyed those institutions in civil society that used to accommodate to the problems that arose, whether there were charitable organizations, there were all kinds of organizations, religious organizations that dealt with some of the problems of health, education, welfare, and all of those other things that we now commonly expect government, or many people expect government to solve. So those institutions, you have to be aware of the fact that a great part of the population is now dependent on the administrative state. And it's through, perhaps one could say, it's not simply their own fault. I mean, those institutions were destroyed in an almost systematic way by the way in which the administrative state thought that it had a superior way of solving the problem. In other words, modern technical rational science and social science. Those traditional ways that we dealt with all of those things lost their authority. And so people, even the family itself, began to lose its authority. Or it certainly took a great hit in the last 30 or 40 years. So I think the first task is try to understand what the problem is, try to make clear the depth of the problem, because it is very difficult now. I think the harder problem that I find is not trying to understand the administrative state, because that's that's the way in which we are taught in the universities. That's the perspective we have. The difficult problem is to try to understand the Constitution again in a meaningful way. Now, of course, everyone says they're for the Constitution, but do they know what it means and how to think about it? Because there's a whole way of thinking about the Constitution. When you read the founders, you read the framers, what informed them, their opinions, and the knowledge they generated about politics was from the philosophic tradition. That philosophic tradition was undermined in the 19th century. We have a tradition of thinking about this that develops from a theory that is hostile to the Constitution. So just that whole difficulty of trying to understand and make meaningful what constitutionalism would require, and try to understand it in a way in which it's meaningful, in which case it means that those who understand that are able to talk about it in a reasonable way. You don't find many defenders of the Constitution who can make arguments about it. They just become dogmatic too. But there are arguments. There are great arguments on behalf of the Constitution once you begin to understand it. The way in which theory informed how they understood politics.
This is on. So one argument I've heard, one solution seems to be reverting back to federalism. However, one argument I've heard is that the enforcement and implementation of particular policies is done better at the executive national level. And along the lines of that argument, this person, he said that Madison did not just talk about factions on a national scale, but also on a state scale. And that his reasoning is that because factions have intruded and influenced state governments so much in a negative way, that in some respects, reverting back to federalism may undermine the enforcement and implementation of some policies that have been executed more efficiently on an executive level.
Yeah, well, I mean, federalism, it seems to me, presupposes genuine politics at other levels than Washington. There is none, as far as I can see. And what that means is, and to get to the point you're making, I hear complaints in my state, in Nevada, from the political office holders who want to do certain kinds of things in their departments or agencies. And they find that their departments and agencies have a perspective that grows out of the way the national bureaucracy understands. What I'm saying, we need to have political rule again. Now, whether it's efficient or not, I mean, because the key to these bureaucracies is that they are meant to be technically rational, more efficient. We have genuine knowledge. These politicians are all reactionaries, but that's problematic. It's clear that all of the expertise that was amassed at the level in the governments of the United States in the 20th century have not alleviated one human problem that existed before and was dealt with in other ways. So we can't make the assumption that technical superior or rational authority is greater than, because they haven't proven. They take the mantle of science, and science at least has done something. But what has social science done? Have they gotten rid of crime? Have they gotten rid of all of the things that were so-called poverty, all the things that was thought that the rational state, the state with all of this, if we turn it over to experts, are going to solve the problem? It seems to me they haven't done it. So I think what you have to do is reestablish genuine politics at other levels. Now, Tocqueville pointed to this early on in Democracy in America when he said, problem is people won't participate in politics if the power to solve the problems is not there. They're not stupid. You're not going to try to deal with the problems in your local government or in your state if you know that those problems are solved in Washington. How do you get, and what that leads to, according to Tocqueville, is people will become increasingly apathetic. They won't exercise their rights in a responsible way. They won't be good citizens because they will be contemptuous of politics. And they'll turn themselves back into their private affairs and become wholly absorbed in their private affairs. And you don't want citizens of a republic not to be vigilant. Remember Federalist 57, Madison says, what's to keep Congress from making laws that treat them differently than the population as a whole? He says Madison says they can make no law which does not fall equally on themselves. But then he says he knows perfectly well they can. He knows but he said, what's going to prevent it? The vigilant and manly spirit of the citizens. And he says if they ever put up with Congress making laws and exempting themselves from it, they'll put up with anything but freedom. So, you have to get people interested in politics, but become responsible in how they think about politics. They must be reasonable when they think about politics. Everybody thinks only in terms of interest now, or other categories. And these categories become fundamental, whether it's race, class, any of these things are fundamental. And if those are more fundamental than the possibility of deliberation or accommodation and compromise, then self-government doesn't have much future. The presupposition of the American founding, presupposition of the role of Congress is it's a deliberative body because the deliberative body requires what? Deliberation. What is the common denominator that makes deliberation possible? Reason. Public reasoning. You have to give arguments. And it's so rare to find politicians that are capable of doing it. And yet, see, my arguments are somewhat theoretical. The modern state, in other words, the administrative state, is actually predicated on the assumption that will should replace reason. That's why they hated the separation of powers, people like Woodrow Wilson. Because it did not enable a particular, the will to dominate. And for Wilson and all of the progressives, of course, that meant that once the parties and the president establish a will, then it's simply a matter of carrying out that will. But the American founders knew. They knew that will can be used tyrannically. That's why they wanted to prevent unified will. They wanted Congress to deliberate and legislate. And they knew that that was not the whole of the necessity of government. They knew there had to be energy in government and the ability to make decisions. So they unified the executive and gave the executive power. But the executive is meant to use the will on behalf of the execution of public reason. So there's a complicated way in which all of this fits together. Separation.
Thank you, Professor. Excellent talk. Hopefully you will make the written remarks available on the website. I'm a staff with the American Legion. It's a veterans organization formed in 1919 after World War I of World War I veterans coming home from Europe. It's a mutual help organization, but it's also a lobbying organization. We have lobbied for many decades to create the Department of Veterans Affairs. It is now the second largest federal agency with a $130 billion budget. My concern is, as a civil society organization, as a public association, with the growth and expansion of the Department of Veterans Affairs, whether that actually takes the lifeblood out of an organization, a membership organization like the American Legion, as veterans then turn to the VA rather than to an organization like the American Legion, such that the dismantling of the administrative state would actually return lifeblood to a membership organization and ensure the future growth of an organization like the American Legion.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, that's the point. I mean, the problem is once you create an administrative, administrative agency, all of the focus goes there. And in some ways, those who are best served are those that have access to that. And increasingly, of course, the professional staffs and all of those really, they undermine the possibility of the spontaneity that originates in the activity of diverse members who can work together without that structure. So, I mean, in civil society associations, they of necessity have to work together. In government associations, all you have to do is get a budget, get an allocation, and then you create a whole new world. And there's no incentive for anybody that's in any agency that gets expenditures ever to do anything but try to increase the expenditures that they have at their disposal. There is no incentive for you're not a good manager in an agency if you tell people, well, I actually cut my budget this year. That means you're a failure in a certain way, right? But in private organizations are capable of responding better to needs and circumstances. That's what I mean about the kind of spontaneity, kind of there's something in civil society that you can't calculate because you don't know what it is, because the possibilities arise from many things that give life. So I think that it will take a while. Let's assume that we did get rid of some of these kinds of agencies. It would take a while before people would begin to understand that they had to solve these problems themselves. Necessity is a great spur, really, to action. And when people find it, when it's necessary for them to do it, I think we'd be surprised. Just as you look in the free market, in any kind of activity where there is no kind of rational, coordinated effort, you see a great deal of innovation. You see a great deal because people are trying to think of ways to get things done. And when you institutionalize something, you tend to do things the way they were done before. And it becomes really an impediment to innovation. Even success itself, as people like Peter Drucker in the management field have shown, success itself ultimately prevents big companies from being able to adapt in a way because they're so used to success and they do things that led to success that they fail to see how things are changing. And they don't adapt. And then they end up losing their share of the market to those companies that do see new needs, new necessities. So it's a different kind of world, the bureaucratic world. And it's going to be hard, I think, to revitalize the institutions of civil society. But one thing that is always possible that you have to be prepared for by having knowledge of these things, there's always going to be some crisis that necessity reimposes itself. Because in the West, for a long time, I think we've deceived ourselves into thinking that we've created reality through our decisions, rather than there is a reality. And that reality one day will impose itself, reimpose itself, when the foolishness of the decisions that have been made over a long period of time come to be incapable of being continued. So reality is always the real check, I think.